So the first one here is the laws for environmental protection. So what are the acts which have been enacted here? The first is your Wildlife Protection Act under 1972. Then you have the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, which is amended in 1974 and 1988. You also have your Environmental Protection Act of 1986 and the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, which was amended in 1988. And then you have your Hazardous Waste Act of 1989. See, all these acts have been enacted to ensure that the wildlife is protected, the environmental pollution is in control, and also that the water is preserved. Okay, so these have been the various acts which have been enacted.
2015, the country ran on 100% renewable power for 300 days, and as of September 2016, it's racked up 150 days. Almost all of their electric energy needs come from hydropower and geothermal heat, although there are still roughly 2 million cars running on gas. And while there are efforts to continue modernizing the renewable resources, the country's hydroelectricity is generated by turbines in dams, accounting for 78% of Costa Rica's electricity supply. Additionally, in 2014, the country approved a nearly $1 billion geothermal project using heat from the earth to power electric generators. Instead of solely using geothermal heat to power generators, which can then provide electricity for heating homes, Iceland pipes geothermal heat via water directly into 87% of homes. Since the 1940s, the Icelandic government has worked to promote geothermal resources, even creating a specialized agency to oversee research and implementation. It's estimated that using geothermal heat instead of oil has saved roughly $8 billion and lowered the country's carbon emissions by more than 1/3 from 1970 to 2000. It is home to 8 major river systems, providing enough current to continually replenish the country's supply. However, in recent years, the country has been forced to import some of its energy needs as demand.
At the National Geographic Society, we explore our changing planet and enable millions to better understand it. And we've been doing it for more than a century. We have an epic story that is far from finished. But to understand where we're going, we must first explore where we began. After our discoveries, we'd create what would become one of the most recognizable publications in the world, the National Geographic magazine. The very first issue is sent to a roster of just 200 members. And from there, our society takes off.
World Wildlife Fund. The World Wildlife Fund is an international, non-governmental organization founded April 26, 1961 by Victor Stollen, Julian Huxley, and Max Nicholson in an effort to protect endangered animals. Today, it is known globally as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and its goals have expanded significantly. Once the founding document, known as the Morge Manifesto, was produced, the WWF opened its first office months later in Morge, Switzerland, on September 11, 1961. On that date, the organization was registered as a charity, and its mission to raise funds for wildlife conservation
My name is Thevan Orfels, and people call me Iceman. And now I'm 79 years old. My profession is civil engineer. I have no child. I'm living here for the last 9 years in Leh Ladakh. At present, I'm working as social work, particularly helping the farmer, mostly in water conservation works. I'm being from Ladakh. Ladakh is the major glaciers situated, and melting of the ice and receding of the glaciers speedily in the regions. Our main source of irrigation water is the glacier melt water. I'm being a civil engineer and come from a farmer family, and I have visited every nook and corner of the district where I found the farmers are facing problem for the last 30-40 years for the shortage of water. At that time, I have a good opportunity to visit each and every village. So I realized I must contribute to mitigate their problems. So I started experimenting various methods of water consumption. However, in 1987, I invented the artificial glaciers. It was a big success, and people appreciate it.
Power plant accident inside the Soviet Union.
In radiation levels around the plant up to 3 times natural radiation levels. They assume they got a leak.
Chernobyl accident is almost half a world away. Residents throughout the Northland are worried about the possible health effects from fallout, worried about the safety of our own nuclear reactors, and worried about the possible economic consequences of the accident.
On the 26th of April 1986, an event took place that officially killed 31 people and left an unknown number of people affected for the rest of their lives. It rewrote the safety rules in nuclear energy and caused the 1,000-mile radius to be safely uninhabitable to humans for a few hundred years. It was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The Chernobyl disaster initially took the lives of 2 workers, followed by 29 people later from radiation-related deaths and 4 men from a helicopter that crashed trying to contain the fire at the plant. In total, the Chernobyl accident cost the Soviet Union the equivalent of £200 billion and drove millions from their homes, making it the biggest nuclear disaster in history, and we can all only hope that it will stay that way forever. I never really knew the full extent of this disaster before heavily researching it, and I've realised how devastating it must have been for those involved.
Plastic flow sheets, and at that time we began to become very concerned.
On June 8th and 9th, General Studer goes with Rick Hoblit on his surveillance flights over the volcano.
You know, you hear the wind and you see how big it is, and you're so close to it you feel like you could reach out and touch it, but you're afraid that if you did, it'd burn your hand. There was no doubt that there was something going on underneath this ground and that it wasn't happy. It was not a happy camper.
On the morning of June 10th, General Studer orders a full evacuation of Clark, leaving behind only a 1,500-person security force.
The top priority for Clark officials this morning was getting people safely out of the area. Staging areas were set up on the Clark flight line to make the evacuation of over 14,000 people as smooth as possible.
They cover just a tiny portion of the planet, only 2% of all our land, but they're home to more than half the plant and animal species on Earth. They're called biodiversity hotspots because they're in grave danger. Now conservationists are coming to the rescue. They've mapped out 17 of these so-called hotspots, each home to plant and animal life that's found nowhere else. If any one of them disappears, thousands of species will be lost forever.
They're the areas that deserve bonus points, very special attention in any efforts to conserve biodiversity worldwide. All of the hotspots have under 25% of original natural vegetation remaining. In some cases, only 1 to 5% of original habitat remains.
Most of the hotspots are in the tropics, and most are rainforests. They're disappearing because of destruction by humans, including unsustainable logging, the burning of jungle areas to create farmland, and uncontrolled development. Some hotspots stand out as top priorities, like the island of Madagascar, home of the remaining 50 species of lemurs. Conservationists are working to see that all the biodiversity hotspots are protected, to ensure that this planet's rich and diverse natural wealth is carried safely into the next century.
There is a tendency to descend into gloom and doom. But what we have with the threatened hotspots approach is a way of making this biodiversity crisis that much more manageable. And that is why we are recommending that these threatened hotspots receive maximum international attention in the years to come.
Conservationists are working to see that all the biodiversity hotspots are protected, to ensure that this planet's rich and diverse natural wealth is carried safely into the next century.